This morning's title is The Father Revealed. We start the journey, we start in Exodus, so we go to Exodus 33. And Moses said to the Lord, "You have been telling me, lead these people, but you have not let me know whom you will send with me. You have said, I know you by name, and you have found favor with me. If you are pleased with me, teach me your ways so I may know you and continue to find favor with you. Remember that this nation is your people." The Lord replied, "My presence will go with you, and I will give you rest." Then Moses said to him, "If your presence does not go with us, do not send us up from here. How will anyone know that you are pleased with me and with your people unless you go with us? What else will distinguish me and your people from all the other people on the face of the earth?" And the Lord said to Moses, "I will do the very thing you have asked, because I am pleased with you and I know you by name." And what struck me about this is quite an important aspect, really. And I think Moses has sort of recognized it here. Moses says, "How will anyone know that you are pleased with me and with your people unless you go with us? What else will distinguish me and your people from all other people on the face of the earth?" And that's quite a tremendous statement, really, that Moses realized that apart from God and the presence of God and God being with him and the people, there was no difference between them and the other nations. It's the presence of God in a person and a nation's life that makes them different, makes them significant. And as I was reading this, I was thinking, well, it hasn't changed, has it? That is what distinguishes us from the people around us, or should distinguish us from the people around us. And the thing to note is there should be a distinguishing factor in the lives of God's people. They should be different. And that's quite a challenge, because oftentimes it's very difficult telling who the children of God are and who the people of the world are. But Moses here realized and acknowledged, well, God, if you don't go with us, we're no different to the others. It's you that makes the difference. And the Lord says that he will go with them. We go on to the next slide. Then Moses says an interesting thing. He wants the presence of God to go with them, but Moses is getting quite bold here, really. And he says, well, I want to see your glory. Who wouldn't want to see the glory of God? And Moses said, "Now show me your glory." And the Lord said, "I will cause all my goodness to pass in front of you, and I will proclaim my name, the Lord, in your presence. I will have mercy on whom I will have mercy, and I will have compassion on whom I will have compassion. But," he said, "you cannot see my face, for no one can see my face and live." We go to the next slide. God says he will show Moses his glory. But he says, you cannot see my face. No one can see me and live. You can only see the back of me, is what eventually happens. If we go to the next slide, the continuation in the story. Then the Lord said, "There is a place near me where you may stand on a rock. When my glory passes by, I will put you in a cleft of the rock and cover you with my hand until I have passed by. Then I will remove my hand, and you will see my back. But my face must not be seen." It's sort of quite dire, isn't it, really? You think, well, anybody sees the face of God. That can't happen. And God says to Moses, I will pass by. I will put my hand in front of your face, and when I've gone past, you will see the back of me. And I was thinking, well, how much information do you get from somebody when you see their back? Well, you don't get a lot, do you? There are some people you want to see the back of, but normally you don't want to see the back of a person. You want to see the front. You want to see their face. It's the face where the character is. It's where the personality is. It's where the real person is. You can see so much in a person's face. But if you look at their back, you can't see it. So yes, it's good that God revealed his glorious back. But you think, well, is that so wonderful? I would want to see the face. But God himself has said to Moses, no, you can't do that. You can't see the face of God and live. Just shows you that there's something, the immense glory of God when viewed face on is so powerful that you just can't take it. It's too much. And I don't think it's judgment on a person seeing the face of God and not living. I think it's just the sheer majesty, the sheer glory, the sheer awesomeness of what you see. It's just too much to take on board. You can't do it. But Moses wanted to see the glory of God, and God was gracious enough to allow him to see the back of that glory. I want to look at this in the King James because it's quite interesting. The NIV translates a lot of words as favour or pleasure. But actually, if we look at this in the next slide, we see it in the King James and see the way the King James translates it. And Moses said unto the Lord, see, thou sayest unto me, bring up this people, and thou hast not let me know whom thou wilt send. Yet thou hast said, I know thee by name, and thou hast also found grace in my sight. Now therefore I pray thee, if I have found grace in thy sight, show me now thy way, that I may know thee, that I may find grace in thy sight, and consider that this nation is thy people. And he said, my presence will go with you, and I will give you rest. And we go on to the next slide. And he said unto him, if thy presence go not with me, carry us not up hence. For wherein shall it be known here that I and thy people have found grace in thy sight? Is it not in that thou goest with us? So shall we be separated, I and thy people, from all the people that are upon the face of the earth. And the Lord said unto Moses, I will do this thing also that thou hast spoken, for thou hast found grace in my sight, and I know thee by name. The word for grace in the Hebrew, I think it's ken or something like that, but it also means favour. So there's nothing wrong with the NIV translation. But I just think it's interesting that the word for favour is actually the word for grace in the Old Testament. And when you substitute grace, because grace is so important to us as Christians, when you read passages like this in Exodus in the King James, you get that word grace coming through. And I think that's a very powerful thing to know, that grace is mentioned quite a few times in that chapter, in a few verses. But it shows the heart of God. It shows that he wants to be gracious and he wants to have favour, display his favour to us. But in this passage, Moses, all he gets to see is the back of God. Doesn't see the face. He doesn't see the real character. He doesn't see God in a way. He just sees the back of him. And in a sense, you think, well, that's not a lot of use, really. But then we come into the sort of the New Testament. So we go to the next slide. This comes from John 16, verses 2 and 3. And this is I think this is pretty well the day before Jesus' crucifixion, where he's sort of talking to the disciples. And this is what he says. He says to the disciples, they will put you out of the synagogue. In fact, the time is coming when anyone who kills you will think they are offering a service to God. And they will do such things because they have not known the Father or me. And so Jesus is warning them that actually what will happen is there will be a group of people who think they are serving God, who think they are the servants of God, who think they are doing the will of God, and they will kill you because they believe what they are doing is what God wants. And they will be so adamant in that. And yet Jesus says here that even though they say they're operating in the service of God and doing what he wants, actually they will do such things. Why? Because they have not known me and not known the Father. So it's a warning in a sense that there will be people who will say they serve God, follow God, and yet Jesus says, no, they don't know me and they don't know the Father. A lot of things will be done in the name of God and have been done in the name of God. But Jesus says they never knew me or the Father. But why would people serve God, think they're serving God, and yet actually have no understanding of the Lord or the Father? It almost seems, well, how can you do that? But as we see through these sort of passages I look at, this seems to be quite a prevalent feature of people and of the disciples, that when they look at Jesus, they don't see God. They think God is separate. They think God is something different. But if we go to the next slide, this comes from John 17:6. Jesus says to them, I have revealed the Father to you, to those who you gave me out of the world. They were yours. You gave them to me, and they have obeyed your word. So Jesus says, I have revealed you, Father. Jesus reveals the Father to his disciples. Jesus shows the Father to the disciples. And he's quite categoric in said that. And if you go to the King James, it says, I've manifested thy name. The name in biblical sense is always the character. It very rarely refers to the sort of what somebody is called by. It invariably means the character of a person. And so Jesus says, I have manifested thy name. I have revealed thy character to the men which you have given me. So Jesus shows to people the Father. Jesus is in fact saying, if you see me, you see the Father. There's no difference. But as we saw in that previous verse, people thought, well, God is different to Jesus. They're separate. Makes you wonder what type of God they wanted. But when they saw Jesus, no, you're not God. If we go to the next slide, even the disciples fall into the trap of not appreciating who Jesus is and who he represents and what can be seen in him. Philip said, Lord, show us the Father, and that will be enough for us. It's an interesting statement, isn't it? Philip is talking to Jesus, and given all that Jesus has done over 3.5 years or whatever, and then Philip sort of, you want to whack the guy really, don't you? You think you've been with him so long, haven't you got it? But he hasn't, and I don't think he was the only disciple. I don't think he was the only person who didn't get it. He makes this statement, Lord, show us the Father, and that will be enough for us. In a sense, what Philip is saying, Jesus, you are not enough for us. The Father is enough for us, but you are not enough for us. Now, why would somebody say that? And I think my feeling is that what had happened over the years is that this concept of God the Father, perhaps he was seen as sort of being an angry God, a God who, at the turn of a coin could whack you one. Or perhaps they thought, well, God is vaster than you, more vast, bigger than you. Why did Philip say to Jesus, show us the Father? And yet Jesus says, well, look, if you've seen me, you have seen the Father. There's no difference. If you see my character, you're seeing the Father's character. If you see my nature, you're seeing the Father's nature. How can you say, and he says that at the end, how can you say, show us the Father? Have I been with you so long and you haven't put two and two together and worked out that actually, if you see me, whatever you see in me, you will see in the Father. Whatever you see in the Father, you will see in me. There's no difference. In fact, there's many places in the New Testament where Jesus categorically says, I speak the words of the Father. I don't speak anything that he hasn't told me. He also says, I don't do anything that I haven't seen the Father do already. Whatever the Father does, I do. The two work in harmony with one another. They don't operate independently. Whatever the Father is about, the Son is about. Whatever the Son is about, the Father is about. But the thing to note is that the disciples, what are they seeing? Well, they're not seeing the back. They're seeing the face. See, Moses could only see the back of whatever it was he saw. But the disciples are extremely fortunate. They can see the face. They can see the face of the Son of God. And by inference, because Jesus says, well, if you've seen me, you've seen the Father, they're seeing the face of the Father. There's no difference. And yet, one of the disciples, for whatever reasons, thought, well, there's a difference between God the Father and God the Son. God the Son, it's almost like the mini-me of God the Father. I want to see the big one. What do you want to see? Well, he obviously thought there was something different between the Son and the Father. There's something about the Father is, different, whatever it was he understood that difference to be. And yet Jesus said, no, if you see me, you see the Father. There's no difference. I think it's very easy that if we read the Old Testament, if you focus on the Old Testament, it is very easy to get a sort of an understanding of God. And you think, well, that's the way God is. Then when you come into the New Testament, you read the Gospels, and Jesus says, well, I am God. I show you the Father. To think, well, hang on a minute, there's a discrepancy between what the Old Testament shows and what the New Testament shows. And maybe that's a problem. Maybe that's Philip's problem. He's sort of thinking, well, I know the Scriptures, and, I didn't have the New Testament then, all they had were the Scriptures, but I see a different God there. Maybe what has happened is that the mindset has become such that they think, well, the God of the Old Testament, that's one character, but Jesus is another character. There's a dichotomy between the two. They're different. We go to the next slide. Jesus cried out, whoever believes in me does not believe in me only, but in the one who sent me. The one who looks at me is seeing the one who sent me. I have come into the world as a light, so that no one who believes in me should stay in darkness. Now I find this interesting, because Jesus is quite categoric here. He says, whoever believes in me doesn't believe in me only, but believes in the one who sent me. If you believe in Jesus, you believe in the Father. It's as simple as that. In a sense, you're believing in the same character, the same personality, the same sort of... It's very difficult to describe, but you look at one and you're seeing both. They're not different. And in fact, Jesus says, the one who looks at me is seeing the one who sent me. We're not different. But Philip obviously thought there was a difference because he wanted, well, show us the Father. Well, Jesus says, well, no, you've seen me, you've seen the Father. But then Jesus says this, I have come into the world as a light, so that no one who believes in me should stay in darkness. Now I found that interesting that Jesus says he came into the world as a light, so that nobody should be in darkness. Now, if you follow this through, this means prior to Jesus coming, there was darkness. It's the only way you can make sense of this statement, I think. Jesus comes into the world as a light. Therefore, what must have gone before must have been darkness or a shade of grey, however you want to look at it. But Jesus says here, I came into the world so that people shouldn't be in darkness. As I was thinking about this, I thought, well, does that mean that everything that's gone before is darkness? Is the Old Testament darkness? Now, we might think, well, no, God is revealed there. Well, he is, but I think we have to see the Old Testament as not light, because Jesus categorically says, I came into the world as a light. You have to infer your own sort of understanding of that, but Jesus does say he came into the light so that people wouldn't be in darkness. And if we go, and the thing to note about most of these passages is they come from John. It becomes quite important to realise that what John is saying. The next slide is actually a slight detour. We go off into the book of Matthew. But Matthew writes this, Matthew 4:13-16. Leaving Nazareth, he went and lived in Capernaum, which was by the lake in the area of Zebulun and Naphtali, to fulfill what was said through the prophet Isaiah, land of Zebulun and land of Naphtali, the way of the sea beyond the Jordan, Galilee of the Gentiles. The people living in darkness have seen and it's not just a light, have seen a great light. On those living in the land of the shadow of death, a light has dawned. Now, what did Jesus mean by saying a great light? The people living in darkness, well, how are they living in darkness? What is the darkness? But the people in darkness have seen a great light. Well, what is the light? Well, Jesus has already said he's the light, but John opens his gospel with this concept about the light. So we go to the next slide. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was with God in the beginning. Through him all things were made. Without him nothing was made that has been made. In him was life, and that life was the light of all mankind. The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness has not overcome it. Well, why does John start off his gospel with this concept of the light and then follows it through? What does he mean by saying Jesus is the light? When Jesus comes, the light is switched on. Prior to that must have been darkness. I can't see it any other way. So what is the darkness? What has caused the darkness? Why is it dark? If Jesus is the light, and this glorious light, then what has gone before has to be seen as, well, not in the light. You see, the thing is that Jesus comes into the world as this great light. And from those verses in John, it's obvious what he's saying is, I've come to manifest the Father. I come to do the work of the Father. I come to say the words of the Father. If you see me, Philip, you see the Father. I and the Father are one. And if you look through the whole Gospel of John, you will see many references occurring to this sort of intricate nature that the Father and the Son have. They're entwined in such a way that actually, I don't think you can really distinguish them. They are one and the same, in a sense. difficult to get your head round. But this is an important thing, that when Jesus comes into the world, he comes in as a light. Therefore, what must have gone before must have been darkness. And he says of himself, I've come, I have manifested the Father to you. I've shown the Father to you. Philip, if you see me, you see the Father. I think one of the reasons Jesus came into the world was actually to give that visible face to God the Father. And this is what he looks like. Not in the sense of, physical appearance, but this is his character. What you see in me is the character of God the Father. What I do is what the Father does. What I say is what the Father says. And that's a tremendous thing, I think. Moses could only see the back. But people at this time, when Jesus comes, this bright light, people can look at his face. They can look into his eyes. His eyes can look into them. Don't know whether that's good or bad, but you can see the face. So something has changed. That this is a tremendous thing to know, that it is possible to look into the face of God and not look at the back. But it all hinges on the work of Jesus and what he did. So to me, what has been revealed is the Father is revealed in the Son. And I think that's quite plain in John. But to me, as I was reading it, it says, well, be cautious about the Old Testament. Jesus is the light. When Jesus comes into the world, the light comes into the world. The illumination, the brightness. You have to be very careful about what has gone before. Amen.